Welcome into section 5 of the course. At this stage, you should have a track that's finished, or at the very least, you should have an arrangement that's finished. Maybe there are still some fine-tune adjustments that need to be made. Maybe you need to add in some transitions, some sweeps, even an additional percussion part. But as long as you have an arrangement, some kind of a track where you can get some stems, then you're in the right place, because this is the mixing portion of the course. And mixing is one of those things where the tasks required could be very minimal to almost nothing to some really extreme overhauls. And actually running the gamut there with your tracks is going to work out really well for us here as we move forward. Of course, it's not 100% required that you have a track finished, but for your own point of view and for your own perspective, having a track done is going to be useful, because in this section, you'll have the opportunity to mix not only your own track, where you kind of know the direction that you're going in, but also you can mix other people's tracks. Maybe it's my track or somebody from the community where you maybe don't know what that person is going for. And so it's a really interesting experience and an opportunity for you to compare and contrast those experiences, and then also, of course, come back and listen to them all so you can hear how one person's ear is going to interpret a song in one way and how your ear might interpret it in another. And there are no right or wrong answers. And to me, that's what actually makes this mixing portion of the course so cool. It's not about trying to come up with the best mix, because that's not really something that's possible. Rather, it's about listening to the differences in how our own ear is interpreting a song or interpreting those stems, in which then we're using the mix portion of the course to create that final track. So this presentation is all about what is mixing. And you can see here we have the kind of cliche picture of the engineer over the console. Really looks like he's into what he's doing. And really a picture like this is sort of what gets a lot of people interested in maybe not only mixing, but just making music in general. But of course, you realize that, it's not what you see in the movies. The reality is always a lot different. And I think a lot of us have this maybe misconception that a mixing engineer kind of comes in, they move some faders around, they have all this outboard gear, they kind of, twiddle things here and there, and boom, they suddenly have this magical mix. But it couldn't be further from the truth, because just like with making music, mixing is all about thinking, it's all about problem solving. So if I had to define mixing, I would probably say mixing is as simple as just putting all of your pieces together. And that really is what mixing is. You have your stems, you put their volumes relative to one another, you change frequency balances, you change dynamics, you maybe add in some reverb for cohesion, etc. But at the end of the day, all you're really doing is putting the pieces together so that you have a full picture in front of you, right? If you were looking at a canvas of a painting, it's not as if every single thing is the same size. It's not as if everything is one brightness. It's all about relativity and about contrast. So it is as simple as putting the pieces together, but it can be a lot more complicated than that. And actually, in the Mixing Perspectives course, I'm going to define mixing using just specifically one word that I think sums a lot of this up a lot better. But because we're not really diving into the deep end here on this course, at least when it comes to mixing, I'm going to hold off. But believe it or not, you will see that word come up in a later presentation. But more often than not, when you ask somebody to define mixing, whether that's a professional, an amateur, or you're just reading something on a forum, a lot of times the definition goes something like this: taking all of your tracks and combining them in a way that sounds the best. Okay, and you know what? I really don't have that big of a problem with this definition, except that we don't have a way of defining what is the best. So here on this slide, we're going to talk about what sounds best. How do you determine that? Is it what sounds best to you? What sounds best to somebody else? I have my own definition for what sounds best, but again, that's not something we're going to be getting into in this section, because this is still about just expressing yourself. And that's why this first question is probably the only one where I would just kind of answer yes, at least specifically in this course. So for what sounds best, is it subjective, as in what sounds the best to you? And again, in this course, I would say the answer is yes. because you don't really have to worry that much about an audience. We're not that concerned with like sales or listening to what somebody else is telling us to do. We're just doing this based on our own instincts and our own creative impulses. And if you think about it, if you go into somebody's car, and you probably all know somebody like this, they've made some big changes to the simple little like graphic EQ. You have like bass treble and like they've really cranked it up or something. And you're sitting in the back seat and you're going to yourself, wow, this sounds absolutely terrible. Like the balance is all off. I can't even hear what the words are anymore. It's just a bunch of sub bass. But the person who's driving the car and maybe the other passengers are really loving it. They're really into it. And if that's the case, then who really cares? Because this is what's sounding best to them. They're using that music for their own experience. And we have to remember that everybody is different. Everyone has their own taste. Is it my taste? Maybe not, but that doesn't matter because this is all about individuality and creativity. They don't give you those controls on your car stereo so that you don't use them, right? I mean, they're there to be used. So whatever somebody wants to do, whatever sounds best to them is A-okay. Another question or determining factor in what sounds best is what sounds best, or I should say, is it what sounds best at a loud volume, a soft volume, or something in the middle? And again, those are even subjective terms. Like what's loud for you may not be loud for me, or what's soft for you may not be soft for me. And we remember back from looking at the Fletcher-Munson curve that all frequencies relative to loudness are not created equally, just meaning that if we turn up the volume really loud, we're going to hear more bass. If we turn it down really low, that bass starts to disappear. And that's just a psychoacoustic principle. That's just how we're hardwired. But then that causes some problems because if you're mixing at one volume and it sounds the best to you, what happens when you turn it up and you turn it down? Suddenly that frequency response is changing, and it's not just relevant to bass, it's relevant to all of the frequencies as we saw on that Fletcher-Munson graph, I think in the very first week of this course. So again, if we go back to the first question, for what sounds best, is it subjective? I would say yes. Determining the volume, again, that's up to you. Whatever's like a comfortable listening volume for you, that's probably what you're going to work at, and that's where the music is going to sound the very best. For other people, a determining factor in whether or not their mix is good is how it relates to a reference track, how it relates to something that's been done professionally. So you bring in the reference, you mix your track, you're constantly listening for balances, listening for cohesion, listening for the frequency response, the relative brightness, how much subs are in there, how much like mid frequencies. And for a lot of people, that's how they determine what a really good mix is. For me, I don't really see it that way, but you understand why when we move on and go into the more advanced topics. Does it sound good in mono? This is a big consideration if your music is being made for the club, for radio, for restaurant or a department store. Maybe that's not relevant to most of you right now, but in the future it might be. And if that's the case, then suddenly you need to spend most of your time mixing that track in mono to make sure that it sounds the best it possibly can. And then you make the stereo considerations afterwards, but only as long as that mono signal is really stable, really solid, and really sounds the way you want it to sound. But really, there are hundreds of questions we could ask about what makes a mix the best or how combining these pieces together is the best. And we're never going to get a definitive answer. There's never going to just simply be you do this and it sounds the best. If that was the case, there would be no use for a mixing engineer. A computer could just do it. You could write an algorithm, it could analyze it, and it would mix it to the best. But the beauty of music, the beauty of art is that it's all in the ear of the beholder, and somebody at some point is making those determining factors of how do I want to make these balances? Do I want this to be wet? Do I want this to be dry? Does this need EQ? And again, that list just goes on and on and on. But really, what sounds best? The answer to this question and nearly every question when talking about mixing is it depends. So it's all about the situation that you're in and the person who's sitting behind the desk making those decisions. So if we go back and think about this, let's just go down to that first bullet, the fourth bullet. Does it sound good in mono? Is it stable in mono? For some people, for certain tracks, that is what's going to make it sound the best. So it depends. But for another track, maybe it's exactly the opposite. You just have to make sure each and every mix that you approach, You refresh your brain and ask yourself, what do I have to do to make this sound the best that it possibly can, remembering that there is no such thing as the best. So it's a little bit confusing, a little bit hypocritical, but I hope that that makes a little bit of sense to you guys. Up next, I just wanted to talk about a few basic mix concepts that I think will be relevant even if you're brand new to mixing. So some things to keep in the back of your mind. And here I'd say the first and the fourth bullet are kind of connected. So just like with production, you should spend a lot of time thinking, not simply just guessing or shooting in the dark. And you also want to have a goal or a plan for your mix, and then you want to stick to it all the way through. Or if you realize you need to make a major overhaul, start over. So just as a few examples here, you know that every single channel on like a console, on a channel strip has, let's say, an EQ, it has like a gate, it has some kind of a compressor, you have your pan pot, you have your volume control, and you're thinking that because I have all these things here, I should be using each and every one of them. So this sound definitely needs EQ, it definitely needs compression, but you really can't think that way. You have to listen first and then go towards a direction. So if I listen back to the whole track and I'm thinking, that guitar, it really isn't bright enough, so I'm going to have to use the EQ. I'm not just going to randomly throw an EQ on and start guessing around to try to find the right setting if I don't already in my head know what it is I'm trying to accomplish. All right, so you don't want to guess. It's fine to have a plan and for that plan to backfire. Like, that's totally okay, but guessing, you're never going to learn. You're never going to get better if you're always just guessing and shooting in the dark. It might turn out to be the greatest mix you've ever made, but you won't be able to consistently get that kind of a result. And then with having a goal or a plan and sticking to it, the example I'd use here is I listen to all the stems and I decide, you know what, this song, it definitely sounds like a pop arrangement, so I'm going to make it really present. I'm going to make it really bright. Not going to use any really long tails on the reverb. I want to kind of make it in your face, nice and loud, nice and big. And if that's my mindset, every decision I'm making is going to be related to that. So I'm not just then going to suddenly say, you know what, never mind. I actually think this is going to sound better being like lo-fi, grungy, a lot of distortion. You can't just midway through make that decision because everything you've done leading up to that is going the other direction. So once you do have that goal or that plan, stick to it. But if you need to make a change, you're going to have to kind of start over and then again, work towards that direction. You do not want to ever be going in two different directions on a mix. You want to make it pretty clear cut from the beginning what it is you're trying to accomplish. And if you just beat that to death in your head over and over again, that's how you get pretty good results on these mixes and you don't end up overdoing things because you have a simple goal and that's where you're headed. All right, the next bullet point number 2, is a real biggie, especially for people who are new to mixing music or even just new to making music. Make sure your room isn't working against you. What does that mean? Well, there are a lot of people who spend a lot of money on really nice speakers. They have a great audio interface, and then they just kind of like look in a book or they've seen people working, and they just set their speakers up assuming that, okay, if I go the long end of the room, kind of in the middle, this sort of spacing, that's going to be the best place for my speakers. And that is absolutely 100% false. Okay, there's a by the book method, but the by the book method is assuming that you are in a perfectly treated space. And odds are you are not in a perfectly treated space. So the best way to find your speaker placement is to get a friend, tie a piece of rope to each other that's approximately the distance that you're going to be sitting from the speakers. And you just need one speaker to this. Play something that's fairly full frequency, that's in mono, that has a lot of bass to it, and just kind of walk around the room and listen for when the bass sounds the clearest, for when it sounds the fullest. Because if you're in a small room, where you're going to have the most problems is with the bass because of standing waves and phase cancellations. So if a professional mix engineer walked into my room today, they would probably like have a heart attack. They'd be like, dude, your speakers are way too close to the wall. But then I tell them, okay, well, sit down and listen. All right, now let's pull it out and let's sit down and listen. And they're going to agree with me that the first option is a lot better. I'm not in a perfect studio. I have to make the best of what I have, and that's what I've done because I've done a listening test. I've used my ears, and I know that if I pull those speakers out from the wall and I position myself further back in the room, I'm going to be sitting in a major bass dead zone. I could actually play music out of my speakers right now. And if you were sitting in this chair with me, as you were pulling back on the chair and moving further in the room, you would completely hear the bass disappear. So just make sure you're getting the best out of your room that you possibly can. It's probably the single most important thing you'll ever do when it comes to making music. Because if you're not hearing things clearly, or you're not hearing things to the best of your ability based on the room, then you're always going to be kind of going backwards. And this is why you want to monitor on more than one system and in more than one room. Okay, at least checking things. And your car will count as a room. So the reason for that is if I have my mix and I'm thinking, man, this is like the greatest thing I've ever done. I go to my friend's house, I play that mix, and it sounds absolutely terrible. That's usually because either A, there's something wrong with your room, B, there's something wrong with your friend's room. So you want to have a couple of spaces that are pretty familiar to you, so you know that that mix is translating well in different locations. All right, it's not so much that you're concerned with like the perfect acoustics of a room. You just want to make sure that something isn't really sticking out. And that's why your car works really well, because in my example, like I've been listening to the same car stereo system since 2001. So not that that car has a great stereo system, not that the acoustics are good in that car, but I just know what things sound like in there. So if I bring a mix into my car and I listen to it, I'm like, wow, everything is way out of whack. It's probably because my room has been working against me where I've been mixing. And the second little bullet point there, familiarity with a room, speaker setup, and familiarity with your headphones is more valuable than having expensive speakers or having expensive headphones. It's all about understanding what mixes sound like in the room that you're in. So it's really cliche. I know everybody kind of says this, but that's because it's true. You need to listen to a lot of music in your room with the speaker setup that you have before you can ever start to know, is my mix going to be translatable in other rooms and other places? Because if it's sounding totally different from the other mixes that you have, then you're probably going the wrong direction. And this next bullet point is related to this. Headphones are not the devil. Okay, I know a lot of mixing engineers, like, again, turning over in their graves if I say, like, it's okay to mix in headphones. But think about it from these perspectives. Number one, how are most people consuming their music? How do most people listen? Do they listen on a perfect speaker setup in a perfectly treated room? Or are they listening on their iPod earbuds or with a pair of like Beats by Dre? The answer is the latter. And so it's okay if you're coming up with and making decisions based on listening with headphones, because that's how most people are probably going to listen anyway. Also, if I put headphones on in this room I'm in right now, and then I go and I fly to Paris and I'm in a room in Paris and I put my headphones on again, it's the same thing. It's consistency. You know what you're going to get. Rooms, totally different. It can even be the same speaker setup, but rooms, they can play tricks on you. And if you're not comfortable or familiar with that room, it can kind of get a little bit dicey and you may not get the results that you're looking for. So granted, I know that speakers are kind of better because of the phantom imaging that you get. You can really hear if you have a solid center, like the vocal will literally stand out from the speakers and everything kind of then goes around it. Whereas with headphones, you can't get that effect. But you got to realize that if you're in a really terrible room and you're not actually hearing things cleanly, then you will probably want to go with the alternative and use your headphones. It's not the end of the world if you do that. And eventually, when you get so good at mixing that you're in a perfect studio, perfectly treated, then, you don't have to use them anymore. But until that day, always be checking on the different playback systems. And last but not least, this is something you guys all know already. Expensive tools does not equal I put expensive mix, aka like a professional, slick sounding mix. It's all about what you're doing with the tools you have, and it's all about the person who's manipulating those tools. You could put a 5-year-old in a room with the greatest amount of equipment that's ever been known to mankind, and they're going to still come back with something that sounds terrible. And terrible probably across the board. Everybody's going to listen to that and be like, whoa, what happened here? Whereas if you have just a few freeware tools and you know how to use them, you're going to end up getting pretty good results. It's all about familiarity. It's all about comfort. All right, so you might feel pretty overwhelmed with all that was just said in that last slide. And if you're feeling that way, do not worry. In fact, if you're new to mixing, you should feel a little bit overwhelmed because there are so many questions and so many things you have to take into consideration for every single track you're making. And that's where we go back to the it depends, right? What sounds the best? It depends. We're making these considerations, we're asking these questions, and they need to have answers, and you have to come up with strategies. Mixing, simply put, it's problem solving. It's figuring out how to make this track work together, not fight itself. And luckily, we will be doing a specific course on mixing perspectives coming up. It's, on the docket where we're really going to dive into the deep end and, kind of go to this conceptual page and even go a lot further and dig a lot deeper and ask some of those harder questions. But for now, I want you really actually to kind of forget a lot of what I just said, except for the stuff about getting your speaker placement right, because mixing can be a lot of fun. And that's really the way I want us to think about it right now. In your own mind, what is going to make this track sound the best? Not having to worry about any preconceived notions about what's going to be competitive. Because once you start asking those questions, the fun factor kind of goes away, and the amount of experimentation and the freedom you feel, that also gets a little bit restricted. So more than anything else, I want this to be about you mixing to your own taste and to what you think sounds really cool. And if you do that, I guarantee you somebody else is going to listen to that and say, you know what, that sounds really cool also. Here are the image sources, and in the next video, we're going to be talking about whether or not mixing is more of an art or a science. So if you love these theoretical, philosophical videos, then, oh man, you're going to be in for a treat.